First, I want to start by clarifying that I am not the only speaker with a statue at the Smithsonian. Professor Rachel also has one. Es un honor, it is an honor to share with you today how these people that you see here, the Colombian Badgers, changed my scientific career and the way I do science. Maybe one day we'll be able to see them. I was born and raised in Bucaramanga, Colombia, a small city by Latin American standards, but a pretty big one compared to cities in the United States and Europe. My sister and I grew up in a loving and kind of unique household. My parents, pictured here, Hernán Porras and Marta Vitalia Corredor, were first-generation college students who managed to become engineering professors. Based on that and what you just heard at my intro, you might be thinking that I always knew I wanted to be an engineer. And that could not be further from the truth. I actually graduated high school not knowing what I wanted to study. And I only learned that biomedical engineering existed after my mom visited another university that had a similar program. And that already tells you everything you need to know about the state of biomedical engineering in Colombia in 2005. The daughter of not one, but two engineering professors didn't know that the field existed. So, due to the lack of programs in my country at the time, my parents made the personal and financial sacrifice to send me to school in the United States. And I had the privilege of attending the University of Texas at Austin for college. Woo, yay, hook 'em horns. College, as you can see here in this beautiful pixelated picture, was fun but hard. So my parents could obviously help me navigate some things related to going to college, but there are just so many aspects of higher education in the continental US that are hidden, unique, and not found anywhere else. For example, I didn't join a student organization until my junior year because I didn't know people were supposed to. And don't get me started on the added pressures and limitations of student visas. Are there any international students maybe at the conference? Yeah, some. I see some hands waving. Okay, good. Slowly and surely, though, I made progress. In my second year, I started working as a tutor at our university's Learning Center. And thanks to the Women in Engineering program, I also joined a neural tissue engineering lab. In the process, I learned two things. One, that I really like to ask questions and to do research, and more importantly, that I loved to teach. I think I inherited that from my mom, and it is still to this day my favorite part of the job. So I graduated college with the goal of becoming a professor. I know, cliche, like my parents. But honestly, the main reason I did a PhD is that you happen to need one to teach at a university. So I did my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Woo, yay, go Badgers, where I had the good fortune of having the most amazing and supportive mentor, Professor Christine Masters, who you can see pictured here. Christine taught me we could use the exact same tissue engineering tools I had learned about in college to create models of disease so that we could study how and why cardiovascular disease happens in the lab without the need for an animal model. Towards the end of my fourth year, because she was such a fantastic mentor, Kristen started to ask me what I wanted to do for my postdoc. And I have to be honest, I didn't know how to respond. Because here's the thing about me. I am not the kind of person who is super passionate about the science itself. By then, I knew I could find reasons to get excited about most biomedical questions. But I am just not the kind of scientist or engineer that will stay up all night thinking about new biomaterial designs or about how fascinating cell regeneration is. And if you are, I am very jealous of you. So how could I possibly know what I wanted to do in my postdoc and beyond? This is where the Colombian Badgers come in. Around the same time, in 2015, a group of us started an organization to connect and support Colombian students, postdocs, faculty, and staff at the University of Wisconsin. I had the honor of being their first president. I met some of my closest friends in this organization, but one thing I didn't expect was to start meeting so many Colombian professors. There was Professor Tim Oswald, and I know he doesn't look like he's Colombian, but he is. From mechanical engineering, who collaborates still with tons of universities in Colombia and who supports many Latin American graduate students in his lab. And he even told us how he had taken a whole class of UW students to our country just to teach. In my then 9 years in the United States, I had never spoken to a single, I actually not even spoken, seen a single Latinx engineering faculty member, let alone one that was Colombian like me. And remember, I had never actually met a Latina engineer, a Latina biomedical engineer, either in the United States or in my home country. I also met Professor Beatriz Botero, an expert on contemporary Latin American literature. And from her, I learned you could work here and still stay connected to your roots through your scholarship. Finally, there was el Prof. Jorge Osorio. His lab studies and develops vaccines for many viral infections like influenza and chikungunya. I interacted the most with el Prof. Jorge in 2016. If you remember, the epidemic and pandemic we were worried at the time was Zika. And he had just obtained funding from the NIH, from the United States, to research and conduct clinical studies on Zika in Colombia. And that was unheard of and mind-blowing for me. I know there are other disciplines where these exchanges between countries are much more common, but that is not mine. I know those disciplines are well represented here at SACNAS. In biomedical engineering and tissue engineering specifically, everything we do is very much centered around the needs, wants, and desires of the global north. Prior to meeting this amazing Colombian faculty, I really thought I had to split my identity physically and geographically in two. Work Ana, who lives and stays in the continental United States, and Ana Maria, who travels back and forth for personal reasons. So, after meeting them, the next time Christine asked me what I wanted to do next, I told her I wanted to engineer models of disease, but to study tropical infections, like the kinds we have in Colombia or right here in Puerto Rico. She was super excited about this idea. It was cool. Nobody was doing anything similar. Really, nobody's still doing anything similar. But also, like, if nobody's doing anything similar, who would you train with for a postdoc? That's like a fundamental part of the postdoc experience. And she wasn't the only person who said the exact same thing. Pretty much every biomedical engineer we talked to in 2016 said the same thing. Cool idea, I don't know which engineering lab you could train with. So, incredibly long story short, I didn't end up finding a position studying tropical infections, but I did end up finding a project related to global health. As you heard, I was a postdoc in Ilana Brito's lab at Cornell University studying the human gut microbiome. Your gut microbiome changes a lot depending on what part of the world you live in and you're from. I wanted to understand how those differences in the gut microbiome between populations can impact human health. And if you're wondering, no, I had no background in microbiology. So this project really completely broadened my scientific expertise, but beyond that, it fundamentally changed the way I approach science. And let me just briefly explain just 3 of the many ways in which this project transformed my life. First, I learned to question the assumptions we have in biomedical research. And I'll explain what I mean with the data you see on the screen. This graph illustrates the geographic origin of the samples in publicly available gut microbiome data sets. As you can see in the light pink orangish, most of the microbiome samples we have studied so far come from populations in Europe, Canada, and the United States. And no, unfortunately, we don't have racial and ethnic demographic information for these samples. In comparison, we know very little about the microbiomes of populations in other parts of the world. And yet, science and medicine insist that we can assume that what we learn in one population automatically transfers to other populations. My postdoc work, which you can read about later, debunked that assumption. We demonstrated that if we use the same microbiomes from different parts of the world in the exact same experiment, that could lead to completely different health outcomes. That project wouldn't have been possible without the 2 people you see here on screen, Dr. Noel Solomons and Dr. Gabriela Montenegro Betancourt, our primary collaborators in Guatemala. Working with them taught me that outside of the predominantly white US scientific bubble, there are other ways to do science, and there are other ways to build partnerships. For example, this Latina had to remember that in our culture, we slow down, we grab a cafecito first, we get to know each other as people, and then we start doing business. But perhaps the most personal transformation occurred when I started talking science in Spanish regularly. Maybe some of you are having that experience at this conference right now, both in the context of my research and my work in Guatemala and in my public engagement efforts. You maybe have seen some of my crocheted microbes and micromartes on social media before. Because all my training as a biomedical engineer had happened in the continental United States, I had to learn a lot of vocabulary that I had never used before. I suspect some of you in the audience have had a similar experience for your languages. Now, here's the thing. My parents and many others in my family don't speak English. So finally being able to communicate my science in my native language and being able to share what I do with them and with Latinas like me was liberating. As Monica said earlier, I finally felt like I could be my whole self. So how does all of that influence what we do in my very young one-year-old lab at the University of Florida? We use engineering tools to create models of disease tissues in the lab so we can better understand the interactions between humans and both good and bad microorganisms. And we are particularly interested in microbiomes of relevance to the global south. For example, we are building collaborations with local researchers and physicians to study the microbiome of inflammatory bowel disease patients in Colombia. And guess what? 6 years later, we're also finally developing models to study leishmaniasis, one of those tropical infections I was so keen to study when I finished my PhD. And we will, of course, continue to find ways to use art and bilingual approaches with our local and international partners, including partners here in the island, like Ciencia Puerto Rico and Caminos en Ciencia, to make our science accessible to more people and reduce barriers of access to STEM both in Latin America and here in the United States. And I firmly believe none of that would be possible if I had never met these people. People like them may be closer than you think. At your institution, if you're in biomedical engineering, maybe it's in our Latinx and BME community, or maybe it's right here at SACNAS. So let me end with my hope for all of us. May we all find people like them who open our eyes to new possibilities, who inspire us to take risks and to stay true to who we are, and who move us to boldly step into the unknown. Gracias.